conservative, but they just don't articulate it. They're not ever pushed into the place where they've got to find the way of expressing their views rather than just having them and acting on them. But when it comes to politics in a democracy, politicians have to offer things always, and that means that there's a natural tendency for them to put their policies and their suggestions in economic terms. They say, you will be so much better off if you vote for us than if you don't. And gradually the language of economics takes over every question, so that it doesn't look as though there's any real distinction between politics and economics. At least ever since I became a conservative, which was in May 1968 in Paris. I didn't know, I hadn't a very clear idea of how to articulate it. All I knew was that when I looked down the street and saw all these rowdy students throwing stones at policemen, I just said to myself, whatever they believe, I believe the opposite. Right. And then I didn't know what it was. And then it was a sort of lifetime's work to find out what the opposite is. So, and I, somewhat arrogantly, came to the conclusion that it's, if you start thinking about politics in an intellectual way, you are likely to be on the left, because that provides a systematic solution, an answer to the questions, puts it all in a system, and also gives you a rather dignified and self-congratulatory place in the system. But once you started thinking, if you think a bit harder and longer about it, you'll move back to what you would have been if you had never thought at all. You know, and that's my view. Is what an intellectual conservative is. It's someone who articulates the real reasons for not having reasons.
Say that again.
Someone who articulates the real reasons for not having reasons, but just feeling and doing what's right. The initial instinct on the left is that negative instinct, that things are wrong, and they must be rectified. They can only be rectified, however, by the seizure of power. And so we're going to seize power in order to rectify them. But once you've got the power, the negative is still there in your heart because it's driven you all along. You know, that's the thing which has inspired you. So you set about destroying things, punishing people. You find classes who are to blame. You know, the Jews, the bourgeoisie, whoever it might be, and you don't get out of that negative structure. Right. And I feel that's what I felt very strongly in 1968. You know, that okay, of course there are things that are wrong in France, but there are also things that are beautiful and right, and you've got to go through this and come back and rescue those things, which is much more important than destroying a few obstacles along the way. But of course, in the intellectual world, it's extremely corrupting to see things in this Foucauldian way. You know, instead of asking the question, is what Hamza saying true? I ask the question, you know, what power is advancing behind that? You then disappear from the picture, and also what you've said disappears from the picture. I'm no longer engaging with you eye to thou at all, because without the concept of truth, there is no real engagement between people. All I am seeing is the power that's speaking through you, and that, of course, you can look at the whole of culture in that way, which is essentially what the postmodern curriculum is, taking one writer, one philosopher, one musician after another, and just talking about, you know, like Susan McClary on Beethoven. This is fantasies of rape speaking through this music. You know, it's extremely boring after a while because it's totally mechanical.
It's a lens. I mean, one of the things I say about critical theorists, you know, that if it was a lens, that it might be useful sometimes to just peer through that lens, but it's a corneal transplant.
That's,
you know, and
that's a good metaphor. Yeah,
it becomes the only way.
Yes.
And I've seen, one of the things that I've seen with students in my own teaching experience is you know, I've had critical theorists in my classes, and whenever they raise their hand, I could almost verbatim tell them what they're going to say,
Yes.
the response that they're going to give to whatever was said.
Yes.
And
Well, then we need to understand why it is so seductive. You know, as I was saying earlier, the purely negative approach to the status quo is simply going to perpetuate this negativity, and has done. If you're not, the typical conservative, in my reading of events, is someone who looks around himself and he finds things that he loves, you know, and he thinks, well, those things are threatened, they're vulnerable,
Right.
I've got to protect them.
Right.
And it's not often that you find on the left somebody who looks around and finds things that he loves. It's always something that's gone wrong, something that is even hateful, and we've got to mobilize against it. If you've lost any sense that actually the world is lovable and that there are things therefore to be rescued in it, you have actually lost the sense of why there is such a thing as a community in the first place. And that, I think, is one of the things that I felt very strongly throughout my life, that there really are wonderful things that we've inherited. All Americans, however, whatever position in society they are still heirs to something rather remarkable. You know, a rule of law which goes on perpetuating itself from generation to generation. If only people knew how rare that was, they would see that they've got to fight to preserve it. You know, and the same with so many other institutions that we. Language as we inherit it is not the product of a single person. It's the evolved gift of generations, and contained in every word there is a kind of history of the human condition. We're actually inheriting wisdom with language. These words make distinctions that we couldn't have ever made ourselves without their aid. And but we are entering a world where grammar is not given the importance that it deserves. This movement in our schools to abolish grammar as elitist, it's absolutely true that grammar is elitist because it makes a distinction between the people who know it and the people who don't. And that's the kind of distinction that we all need if we're to survive, not only as a civilization, but as individuals too. So this is where the real arguments for conservatism, in my view, should be based, not in the economic sphere at all, but in these fundamental cultural inheritances